Well, Aubrey, what do you think about Jerry Sitzer?
I mean, he was exactly what you said. He was wise beyond belief. I would like to sit at his feet. I know he does this like monastic course where you could kind of live with, I don't know if you're living with him, but live with other students for 3 weeks and follow him as he teaches you the like Benedictine rule and other ancient spiritual practices. That I want to sit under that guy and just be influenced by him.
Yeah.
That's what I want.
You bring up a good point. You know, when it comes to healing from trauma, I've noticed that there is a common thread in those who are teaching healing that we're drawing back from like ancient rule of life, right? Like ancient practices. I mean, so this is why it was written into the Pain to Purpose course when we talk about Sabbath, or we talk about what we call irreducible minimums.
Yeah.
Irreducible minimums are the same idea of a rule of life. If you have heard of that, you know, Pete Scazzero calls it or talks about the rule of life, but it's the idea of like, here's the rhythm of how we operate. And when we get outside of that rhythm, right? And it's a God-given rhythm. It's like, here's what scripture laid out on how we should operate. When we get outside of that, that's when things begin to get a little bit wonky and haywire, and we are now a disintegrated version of ourselves. So whether we're going through trauma or not, we're not able to properly align our hearts with God's heart, and so it exacerbates trauma in our lives, or it could even cause it in our lives too. And so it's like this reversion back to like, let's get back to the rule of life. Let's get back to the way of life that Jesus has called us to. Let's get back to more specifically rest. Silence, solitude, let's process. And that is a lost, I don't want to say art, because it's a lost command. It's like a lost practice. That's a great way of saying it. That's a lost practice in our culture today.
Yeah, it really is. I do feel like, thankfully, I'm seeing the Holy Spirit kind of bring, you know, you're seeing more and more books, articles, even low church folk that are starting to embrace some of these practices. But I do think you're right. Like, there's something very interesting to me that it is often people who have been through pain and have wrestled with, I don't know how to connect with God now. A God is no longer fitting into the strict faith scaffolding I had him built upon. What do I do? We do find that a lot of people in those scenarios, including me, I mean, I went to a spiritual director for 5 years after Cameron died, fall back on some of these ancient practices, and they're just Jesus's way. I mean,
they are.
We can make it like a bigger, I don't want to say a bigger deal, because it is a really big deal. What we're talking about is Jesus's way of Sabbath, of retreat, of soul care, of stepping back, listening to the Father, intimacy with the Father in order to re-engage.
And what we teach in the Pain to Purpose course is that when you implement these things when you're not in crisis, it builds your house on the rock. As Matthew will tell us, right?
Yeah.
And so it's building fortitude and character and strength in Christ so that you're resilient through the storm. And it also can provide healing post-storm or in the midst of the storm, right? So this rule of life, these kinds of ways of Jesus are so imperative to just have in our life, whether we're on a mountaintop or a valley in the middle of our life. And okay, so speaking of this, Jerry talks quite a bit about kind of being present in the moment, right?
Yeah.
Neither looking to, like, and being paralyzed by the past and not worrying too much with the future, but being really present in the moment, which is a lot of what even like some of this rule of life, some monasticism kind of is going to teach. Secular wisdom is going to call it mindfulness, right? But it really is what you're talking about, being experiencing God's presence in the present, right? And living in that presence. And so there's been a lot of questions that the Nothing is Wasted community has asked Aubrey in terms of really truly how to, this is kind of how I interpret those questions. How do I truly get quote unquote over or move on or move through these horrific things that have happened in my past, especially if I've lost, right? And I hear statements that the evangelical church will say like the best is yet to come, or that seems very biblical even, right? Like the best is yet to come. It seems like a very Jesus-esque thing to believe. I'm having trouble reconciling those two things.
Yeah.
The best is yet to come when I feel like the best is behind me.
I've lost the best, or what
I've lost the best, or my best years are, but you're right. Exactly. So how do I reconcile those things? Aubrey, I don't know what your thoughts are. I definitely have thoughts on it.
I want to hear your thoughts, Davey, because I feel like you're almost like practicing this in real time at the moment, just having come out of the trial a few weeks ago and having to revisit some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think that there is a both and that I've experienced where you cannot, you can't suppress or gloss over the very real visceral pain of the loss of what's taken place in your past, right? And the subsequent losses, right? Not just like for me, the loss of Amanda, but also the loss of our life together, the dreams together, what we forecasted our life was going to be like all of those things that are subsequently lost in the wake of the loss of a loved one. And that's just any kind of loss, right? If loss of a job, loss of a dream, loss of it, right? All that stuff that would cause you to point to life is never going to be not just the same, but as good as what that was. Yeah. And so we can't suppress that. Those are very real, visceral emotions that we're going to feel and experience. And I think that we have to lean into those. Yeah. But I remember very specifically, Aubrey, I actually was able to pull out the other day as I've been kind of reflecting on stuff that the notes that I took when I went and did an intensive counseling in Florida with Dr. John Walker, who was my counselor right after Amanda passed away. And one of the things that he said, there were like 5 major points that he had me grapple with. The fourth one, he said this, he said, there's no need to rescue. And I was like, this was like when I say he said this, I have a little paragraph of like probably a full day of wrestling with this, and part of it was like, why was I not there to rescue this? It was a little bit of a drawback of like some negotiation with God that I was dealing with. If you're familiar with that stage of grief, like I could have changed this. How could I have changed this? I could have changed, that sort of thing. And he said, there's no need to rescue because he said, whatever was done. Okay. This is what he said. In this world can't be undone. Like you couldn't have changed what was done. There's nothing that you could have done to change it.
Absolutely not.
In the next world has been completely undone.
Oh, wow.
So living literally in that tension, literally in that razor's edge of between this world and the next world, which, trauma, grief, loss, that really puts you in the middle of this, like, we've talked about this before, the already not yet, the like life
that
to come,
liminal space.
Yeah, there's very much so, right? Heaven touches earth. And so he said, it can't be undone here, but it's already been undone. So with Amanda, it's already been undone. So recognize that, right? Wow. And this is what he said. He said there is nothing unhealthy that can, or there's nothing healthy that can come from dwelling on the horrific and the catastrophic. Wow. He said that dwelling on that will undo you.
Wow.
So he gave me kind of a framework, a construct to go, okay, I can't change this.
Right.
And I have to come to terms and accept that I cannot change this.
Yeah.
But the more I try to reach back and change it or live in it or dwell in it, it will actually change me for the worst. It will undo me, right? And the way that I live in the present, right, and be hopeful about the future is to know that, man, everything that was done to her has been completely undone. Every tear has been wiped away. Every wound has been repaired. She is living absolutely. This sounds so trite and so cliche, but it is like the thing that people say a lot, living your best life. Like she actually living her best life. What she was destined and purposed to live, what all of us are destined and purposed to live in the fullness of the presence of Christ. And so when I kind of came to that reality, it was like, oh, so now I have to figure out how to just live out what God is going to put in front of me and receive whatever that is. Right. And so, and I can attest to the fact that like life is very different. I can't say that one is better than the other. I think they're very, very different. Yeah. But I also can't say that what I'm living now is worse than what it was. Right. It's like this really strange thing where there's like a veil of two lives. And
I was just thinking you've had like
both are amazing,
two paths,
right?
Yeah.
Both had their own pains, their own hardships, their own, but also their own joys, their own beauty. And so that's really what I've had to wrestle with. I don't know.
There's this researcher in Arizona. I think her name is Mary Frances O'Connor. She's like a grief researcher, but she studies the brain in grief. And she talks about how one of the things that we tend to do in grief is we go over counterfactuals, which is basically what ifs. What ifs? What if I would have been there? What if this would have? What if? And she says the problem with counterfactuals is that there are an endless amount of them.
Oh my gosh.
And so you can spend your entire life, if you're not careful, going over all of the would have, could have, should have counterfactuals, imagining every different outcome. And all that is ultimately is just anxiety and control.
Yes.
But you can, like your therapist said, your counselor said, you cannot change it. What's done, it's done, it's done, it's done. And so I think that is a hard lesson for us to learn, because obviously there is an instinct in us that wants to replay and rechange and rehash but the devastating thing that does for our soul does remove us from living the present life. And I think, like you said, looking to the future and trusting okay, but it is in the new heavens. It is undone. And so I can rest, I can trust, I can, and that's one of the beautiful hopes of the gospel, really.
Yep.
And
so true.
I think this question of how do you move forward, I think you're exactly right, Davey. You can't pretend like that pain doesn't exist. Yeah. And you have to grieve it fully, constantly, as long as you need to. And like you said, you also have to grieve not just the loss, but the dreams, I think about, I've probably said this on here before, but I think about a friend of mine who lost her son. And one of her big griefs was like every Halloween, she had little cute Halloween costumes picked out. So every Halloween, it's a new, I'm not getting to dress him in the lion costume this year. I'm not getting, and you have to give yourself permission to do that. Right. And yet, like, she's gone on to have more and more children and had many beautiful memories with them. And so, like you said, it's the both and the already not yet. Learning to kind of surrender in that is God's invitation.
That's exactly the right word, Aubrey. It's surrender, right? Grief processes, we'll call it acceptance, but it's really surrender. It's surrendering to the sovereignty of the Lord. And I think there's a difference between dwelling on the past and grieving the past. Dwelling on the past is where you sit and live in a shallow pool of what happened. Grieving and lamenting what happened is where you go really deep into it, and you lean into it, and you grieve it, and you mourn it, and you lament it, and you let those feelings cascade over you and through you and around you. But ultimately, that depth brings you back to the surface of almost like a different pool, like you're moving into a different space, and not just dwelling in the shallow end of this, past pool. And so, what you mentioned right there, Aubrey, with that, the what ifs. I know we're reserving another time after I've done some processing to talk about the trial, but that is one of that's one of the biggest things that reemerged as I learned more details of what happened that day. Wow. Because in kind of for the first time in a very zoomed out perspective, I saw all of the things that happened that morning that led to the next thing, that led to the next thing, that led to the next thing. And all of even some things that I did, right? And remember, and we'll talk about some more, but like it caused that what I thought was a scar that I had settled to reemerge and caused me to start asking again, what if I had done this? What if I had done this? What if I had done this? And that surprised me because I thought I had settled that.
Wow.
And in fact, there's an entire book entire chapter in Nothing Is Wasted, the book, called What If, right? Where I talk about having to settle those very things. And that reemerged, and that surprised me. And so that all that's to say is that, like, even when you feel like you've settled something, it doesn't mean it's not going to reemerge and you're going to have to settle it again.
Yeah.
So anyways. Yeah.
Wow. Good stuff from Jerry Sitzer. Obviously, lots to keep talking about. We are, as you know, or if you're new to the podcast, we're really passionate about not just having these conversations with you, but actually guiding you through transformation. We believe firmly that we want to partner with you to take back your story. And part of that means to learn how to grieve well and hold your grief well. And at the same time, look for what God has for you in the present and in the future. And so we'd love to invite you to go to nothingiswasted.com/community. We have our community platform there. We have our community plus platform there. All kinds of resources, tools, ways that we want to equip and walk with you through your own grief journey.
Yeah. Yeah. We'd also love to encourage you to engage with us on Instagram. You can follow our ministry at Nothing is Wasted Ministries. Follow me at Davey Blackburn. Follow Aubrey at AubSamp. And we want to thank Sleeping at Last for providing all the music for the Nothing is Wasted podcast. If you're new and you're like, man, what is this music? I love this. It's Sleeping at Last. So go and download his music anywhere where music can be downloaded and streamed. We also love to invite you to review on iTunes, as we mentioned earlier. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple. I guess it's not called iTunes anymore. Apple Podcasts.
Apple Podcasts, right?
And we're on YouTube. So if you're listening to this and you're like, wait, I didn't know you're on YouTube. Yeah, we're on YouTube. So go and follow us on YouTube so that you can make sure you get updates every time that this podcast releases. Hey, friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.